Islands have a special place in imagination. Their isolation makes them inherently mysterious. They often have a unique climate, flora and fauna from their neighbors, and stepping ashore onto an island can very much be like entering a wholly different world. It might be part of the reason behind the appeal to Golden Age pirates, as they were primarily based in the Caribbean, a string of tropical, mysterious islands. Jamaica sits right in the center of the Caribbean Sea, and at the center of the Great American Continent. When looking at a map, it isn't particularly large, nor is the shape especially unique. But the eye still tends to drift to it, owing to its focal placement. Almost as if nature itself is trying to tell us, Jamaica is important. Jamaica was important, is important to many, and every person you ask is undoubtedly able to conjure an image in their head whenever they think of Jamaica. They might think of Bob Marley, reggae, or the Rastafarian movement, cannabis, the iconic accent, James Bond, the Blue Mountains, jerk chicken, or Captain Morgan and his brand of rum. The history of the tropical island can be witnessed in all of these national symbols. It isn't surprising that James Bond visited Jamaica, since his creator owned an estate on the island and had worked in naval intelligence. Jamaica, ever since the English acquisition, was its prime naval station of the region. It was the leading producer of sugar and rum, fueled by enslaved laborers, whose descendants now rule the island as a free people. As for Captain Morgan himself, on this channel we know him well enough, for the real Henry Morgan was crucial to the history of pirates and the history of the island. During the 17th century, Jamaica was a virtual pirate kingdom, a nest of smugglers and scoundrels, and without their questionable efforts, the island would likely not have formed into what we now recognize. Without them, there would have been no sugar, no slaves, no naval bases, no Jamaica, at least as we know it. Jamaica was a very different place before the arrival of Europeans and Africans. Naturally, the landscape was much more dominated by wild vegetation and void of large-scale clearance and agricultural works. This was the case up until quite recently. While the neighboring islands were settled by humans some 6,000 years ago, humans did not appear on Jamaica until the 7th century, even though they certainly could reach it and most likely knew of it. These first inhabitants were the Taino Indians, who migrated from Central or South America to settle the Caribbean islands. Little is known about them. Though the Spanish did write about other Taino groups, the Jamaican one was largely ignored. There is next to no genetic data, and many of their archaeological sites have been destroyed, and besides some proto-writing inscriptions found on rock art, they left behind no written works. They have still left behind a noticeable lexical impact. It is from the Taino that we got everyday words like hurricane, hammock, potato, tobacco, and barbecue. The name of Jamaica itself is a corruption of the Taino Shaimaka, meaning land of wood and water. The Jamaican Taino called themselves Yamaye, meaning spirit of the big coast. It was also a name applied to the island itself. It isn't certain why they moved to Jamaica, perhaps fearing raids from the hostile Carib, or because of overpopulation on the neighboring islands. They began as small communities on the northern coast, and by the 13th century had spread throughout the entire island, though the population never seemed to have amounted to more than 60,000. The people lived in roughly 150 villages, divided among 12 tribes ruled by local chieftains, called caciques. Whilst the caciques were men, they were often chosen by women, and status was underpinned by matrilineal descent. Each community was divided into an upper class of warriors and a lower class of workers, though there is no evidence of servility or slavery. Though conflict did occur between the tribes, they were generally peaceful, and stability was ensured by polygamous marriages between the various chieftains. Wealth was shown by fine clothing, jewelry, and precious items of wood and stone. Especially prominent was the cacique's seat, the duo, which was seen as an anthropomorphic being. They believed it had its own soul and a spiritual purpose. The Yamaya lived in simple, wooden houses, based around poles dug into the earth itself. These structures were perfectly suited to the temperature and geography, for stone structures were susceptible to frequent natural calamities. European settlers would learn this the hard way, and only last year, Jamaica was ravaged by a highly destructive storm. The Spanish colonists would later adopt Taino skills in woodwork and masonry when constructing their own buildings, utilizing native know-how to survive in the New World. The Yamaya were not hunter-gatherers, but farmers, and Jamaica was a fertile island that offered them a highly varied and nutritious diet of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. Cassava was a daily staple, and modern Jamaicans turned it into a bread called bami. It was supplemented by corn, yams, and sweet potatoes, fruits such as pineapples and papayas, and proteins in the form of game, fish, and seafood. The Yamaya were excellent fishermen. Familiar animals like pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats were not introduced until the Europeans arrived, and cooking was primarily done by boiling and baking on griddles fueled by charcoal. We often associate Jamaica with reggae, cannabis, and rum, and mind-altering substances were consumed by the Taino for religious purposes. Shamans would purge themselves with a vomiting stick before preparing and inhaling a psychedelic powder known as cohoba. Made from the seeds of native trees, crushed shell, and tobacco, it was inhaled through the nostrils with a forked nose pipe, called a tabaco. Sounds familiar. We can see the rite depicted on this petroglyph. Overall, life in pre-Columbian Jamaica appears to have been pretty quiet and relaxed. But in the 16th century, that would dramatically change. Christopher Columbus made his first American voyage in 1492, during which he learned of Jamaica on his visit to Cuba. He did not actually visit the island until his second voyage, with the first encounter being hostile. The Yamaya went out in canoes, making war cries and throwing spears, but were repelled by a volley of crossbows. An interpreter was sent ashore, and Columbus was able to meet the locals on friendly terms. They made a good impression on the explorer, who spoke of them positively, and described Jamaica itself as the most lovely that eyes have seen. His Iberian sponsors, Ferdinand and Isabella, decided to grant him ownership of the island. Columbus was hoping to find gold on the island, but his subsequent visits weren't so pleasant. He was shipwrecked for a lengthy period, and had to levy Yamaya's support against a group of mutinous crewmen. The experience left him with mixed feelings of the island, but he nonetheless ensured that it was inherited by his son, Diego. The monarchy confirmed his position as Jamaican viceroy in 1508, appointing Juan de Esquivel as the first governor. With him came a number of settlers, and the island was made a Spanish colony. Esquivel's first objective was to subjugate the caciques and acquire a Yamaya labor force. His campaign is poorly documented. We only know that many of the caciques were taken out, either by combat or execution. Some managed to take their followers and escape into the mountains, forming pockets of long-lasting resistance. Those who remained were integrated into the encomendero system, essentially reduced into serfdom. Treatment of the Yamaya did not improve, and in 1515, reports began to surface of various atrocities, ranging from punishments to simply being overworked. Though a pair of inspectors were deployed to the island to ensure a more humane treatment, the death toll climbed with the introduction of European diseases, and many were forcefully levied for expeditions to Central and South America. By the 1530s, the indigenous population had apparently fallen to a mere 200. The Spanish were primarily looking for gold and silver, since 15th century Europe was facing a shortage of precious metals, driving up the cost. When Jamaica was found lacking in shinies, the crown lost interest. Jamaica was reduced to being a small breadbasket for the neighboring islands. Aside from adopting much of the local produce, the Spanish introduced a massive host of flora and fauna. It ranged from citrus fruits to bananas, and the sugar cane, which would become a staple of the English economy. Cattle, pigs, and goats would become a fundamental part of the landscape and diet. Still, most of the natural and introduced resources went unexploited. And though Jamaica was self-sustaining and had a fairly prosperous economy, it was almost entirely internal, and few ships visited the island. The population would remain small, only counting 1,610 people in 1611. One interesting note is that Jamaica was one of the few islands that permitted Portuguese settlement. The Spanish were very strict about who was allowed to move into their colonies, even forbidding other Iberians and Catholics. Many of the Portuguese settlers were so-called conversos, or crypto-Jews. More impactful was the introduction of African slaves as a solution to the Yamayei decimation. First introduced in 1523, they were brought in to labor in construction, the growing and milling of sugar, clearing woodland, and hunting cattle. The Spaniards had brought with them bovines and released them into the wilderness. However, in spite of the island's agricultural potential, slave imports remained low, and the enslaved population never exceeded 1,000. Still, they constituted around half of the island's population during Spanish rule. Despite Jamaica being so underutilized by the Spanish, they called the island the Garden of the Indies. It represented almost limitless potential, never realized under their control, something which was recognized in 1654 by an English visitor, Henry Whistler. He wrote the following: "It may be made one of the richest spots in the world. The Spaniard doth call it the Garden of the Indies. But this I will say, the gardeners have been very bad, for here's very little more than that which grows naturally." The year after, the island would be brought under English control, and its full, brutal potential eventually realized. Jamaica's minor population made it highly susceptible to pirate attacks. In 1554, French corsairs ransacked the settlement of New Seville, burning all of the wooden buildings. The governors repeatedly pleaded for the home government to supply additional men and weaponry, since if Jamaica would fall to the enemy, the surrounding territories would be highly threatened. These warnings fell on deaf ears, and the militia continued to be small and poorly armed. English pirates raided Jamaica in 1597 and 1603, but the latter assault was successfully repelled. In 1643 they came again, taking the capital of Spanish Town and holding it for ransom. By the 1650s, England had carved out a small colonial empire in the easternmost island chain of the Caribbean. However, this wasn't enough for the newly instituted dictator, Oliver Cromwell, who harbored dreams of eventually taking the entire region. He was further pressed on by a Puritan class of merchants, who wanted a sizable island from which to trade with the Spanish. Cromwell himself desired a central naval base, usable for his frigates in attacks on the biannual treasure fleet. The government had previously had a laissez-faire approach to colonialism, leaving it entirely in private hands. So it was somewhat out of the ordinary when Cromwell put on the iron glove and outfitted a large military expedition to conquer one or more Caribbean islands. This so-called Western design should largely be seen as a state-organized buccaneering expedition, and Cromwell showed no interest in developing Jamaica into what it would later become, a sugar colony. Led by Robert Venables and Admiral Penn, the expedition initially made for neighboring Hispaniola, where poor logistics, morale, and Spanish resistance led to staggering casualties, forcing a retreat. Fearing Cromwell's disappointment, the fleet made for Jamaica instead. Sighting land on the 11th of May, Admiral Penn led a flotilla of smaller craft into Caguaya Bay, landing troops and occupying the nearby forts after a small resistance. The army marched inland to occupy the town of Santiago de la Vega. Here they encountered a flag of truce. The Spanish wanted to negotiate, thinking the English had merely come for provisions instead of a conquest. No resistance was really offered, and owing to the lack of preparations, Jamaica surrendered without much of a fight. The island was to be annexed into the Commonwealth of England, and the Spanish forced to leave with anything they could take with them. Some have referred to the conquest as bloodless, but it is utterly naive to view this singular episode in isolation, for it was preceded by the horrific Hispaniola episode, and succeeded by epidemic and a long guerrilla campaign. Many of the Spanish did not leave the island, but took their livestock and withdrew into the forested, mountainous interior. They freed their slaves and integrated into an established community of runaway chattel and Yamaye stragglers, becoming the Maroons. Their leaders, Juan de Bolas, alias Lubolo, and Juan de Serras, allied with the Spanish, beginning their campaign of resistance. One of the big issues of the English expedition was logistics. Food was in low supply, and the regiments quartered around Spanish Town, formerly Santiago de la Vega, had to forage if they wanted to eat. The island was well supplied at this point by herds of cattle, and the soldiers hunted them ruthlessly. Without any experienced butchers or men capable of preserving the meat, the carcasses were left to rot and waste. The cows were hunted to near extinction, while the men were forced to starve, subsisting on fruit, dogs, mules, and rats. Sanitary conditions were as you might imagine, and disease flourished. One officer remarked how you could not even enter certain parts of town owing to the horrible smell. Soldiers were buried in graves so shallow that wild dogs could dig up and eat them. Arguments broke out between the two leaders, Venables and Penn, and both soon decided to leave Jamaica. Penn out of embarrassment, and Venables from being seriously ill. Both of them were arrested as soon as they returned to London, with Cromwell's feelings of them summed up in one short quote: "A sad example." They were forced to publicly admit their guilt and surrender their commissions. Penn went on to have a fairly successful naval career, and his son established the colony of Pennsylvania. Guess who he named it after? Venable served a brief stint as governor of Chester, before retiring from public life and publishing a book on fishing. And that's nice and all, but meanwhile, the soldiers on Jamaica were coughing and shitting themselves to death. Most of the officer corps had perished, the remainder descending into a political struggle over who should have rights over conquered territory and soldiers. Cromwell had to intervene directly, sending over more troops and even some 1,600 settlers from Nevis, but 2/3 of them perished, as did many of the new soldiers and officers. Attempts were likewise made to put the soldiers to work, primarily in farming, but since the work was hard, payment poor, and they had no women, there were few incentives to do so, and most of them proved unruly and lazy. Meanwhile, the Maroons were becoming more and more bold, launching ever-daring assaults on isolated outposts and patrols. They had been joined by Spanish soldiers and led by a sergeant major, allowing them to carry out lethal operations. In order to resist them, the English reorganized the regiments into more effective units. By now, the soldiers that remained standing were resistant to tropical diseases and battle-hardened, and better able to combat the Maroon menace. Mobility was provided by assistance from the fleet, whereas the Spanish forces were entirely restricted to land. Their goal was simply to harass the English and wait for better times. Better times would come, since Jamaica was crucial to Spanish security in the region. Owing to its central location, an English Jamaica could be used as a naval base to harass their ships and possessions. Indeed, the commander of the fleet, Vice Admiral William Goodson, had already gone on piratical forays into nearby Cuba, establishing a privateering tradition that would be difficult to purge. In response, the Spanish sent additional troops and equipment in 1657. The Spanish had their own troubles. The seas struck them as readily as the occupiers, and one of the commanders even went blind. There was much royal interference in the orders of the expedition, logistics hampered, and one of the leaders, Don Cristobal Isasi, faced discrimination on account of his biracial origins. Meanwhile, the English were taking to the offensive, seeking out the guerrillas, raiding their encampments, and taking their pack animals. Assistance was likely provided by the number of buccaneers invited from Tortuga by Edward D'Oyly, the army commander. These buccaneers might have been invited as sailors, jungle fighters, or simply for their expertise in hunting, cooking, and preserving meat. Either way, the guerrilla war was swaying in favor of the English. Since the Hispaniola episode, the army and navy had learned to effectively cooperate, the latter providing reconnaissance and transport, allowing the ground troops to move around the coast effectively and press down on guerrilla pockets. Spanish efforts were further hampered by a mutiny. A new terci of 557 men landed on Jamaica in 1658. Marching inland to join the Maroons, they soon found the guerrilla camp already devastated, only able to reinforce them with an additional 100. D'Oyly personally assembled a force of some 700 men, offering quarter and safe conduct to Isasi, which was refused. Having constructed ladders and grenades, D'Oyly led an assault on the Maroon fort, and after 15 minutes of brutal melee, victory was theirs. The flag of St. George hoisted over the fort. Isasi lived to continue his campaign of resistance, but in 1660, some of the Maroons switched sides to the English, deteriorating numbers and morale. After a final defeat in February, Isasi and his men fled to Cuba, ending 4 years of obstinate resistance. His defeat cemented the English dominance that would last until Jamaica's independence. Political change was occurring in England. Oliver Cromwell, the master of this colonial venture, had recently perished, and his government was to be replaced by a restoration of the monarchy. People on Jamaica were growing mutinous from these rumors, hoping to overthrow D'Oyly and establish a republic. A pair of army officers planned an uprising, but were deserted by their soldiers, leaving them to be court-martialed and shot. Jamaica appeared more like a massive garrison than any sort of colony. Resource output was next to none, there were few settlers, the economy centered around supplying the army, and defenses had been rapidly constructed. This would change with the restoration of the monarchy, and in 1664, a civil administration was established by Sir Thomas Modiford. Modiford should be seen as the founding father of colonial Jamaica. By 1664, he was already an experienced colonist, sugar planter, and politician. He emigrated to Barbados in 1647, where he purchased a sugar plantation, making himself a fortune by improving the quality of the output. Despite being a cousin of Oliver Cromwell's chief general, George Monk, Modiford sided with the Royalists in the Civil War, but when they were defeated, he switched sides, eventually allowing him to worm his way into governorship of Barbados in 1660. When the monarchy was restored in the same year, he was put in a fairly awkward position. He cleverly resigned from his position as governor, becoming Speaker of the Assembly. In 1664, he was appointed governor of Jamaica. Owing to his duplicitous background, it might seem like a strange decision. But not only was he a skilled sugar planter and slave trader, but he was actually well liked by the people of Barbados. Since the island was having a population surplus, many were looking to relocate and apply their skills in sugar planting where there was still plenty of land to be claimed. Jamaica was free real estate. By the time of Modiford's arrival, Jamaica had become a nest of pirates. Observers compared the island to the Barbary coast, with King Charles II himself calling it a Christian Algiers. Since many of the soldiers and colonists shunned hard work of any sort, and many of them had criminal backgrounds, sailing seaward so to steal Spanish silver seemed somewhat salivating. What had begun as official naval campaigns led by officers like Goodson and Minks had quickly deteriorated into private ventures, and these buccaneers operated out of Port Royal, strategically placed in Kingston Harbour. Known as the Sodom of the New World, Port Royal was known for its rampant debauchery, with the buccaneers spending entire fortunes on women, gambling and booze, often in a single night. They sold their plunder to the agents of London merchants, and spent their earnings on the many services of the bustling port. Its wicked reputation aside, Port Royal housed the biggest community of artisans and craftsmen in the New World, a region in which skilled workers competed with slaves over wages. Modiford was initially skeptical towards the buccaneers' activities, preferring to trade with the Spanish and work on the sugar industry. He initiated a small crackdown, and many of the buccaneers returned to Tortuga. However, Modiford realized his mistake when the Spanish proved hostile. Jamaica was threatened by the Dutch, and the economy tanked. Close to a third of the population were active in the buccaneer trade, not to mention those indirectly involved: barkeeps, suppliers, prostitutes. And with no agriculture or industry established, plunder and the commerce created by it was the overwhelming source of revenue. Furthermore, Jamaica's standing army had been abolished after the Restoration, leaving only a small garrison and token fleet. The buccaneers were the only reliable source of defense, in addition to providing valuable intelligence on Spanish schemes and territory. So, Modiford had to toe the line, permitting the buccaneers to carry on with their pillaging forays, even though Spain and England were officially at peace. Additionally, sugar planting required a large investment capital to get started. You needed land, clearing the land of vegetation, machinery and labor, and it would take several years of hard and patient work in order to reap a net profit. This money did not come from nowhere. It came from buccaneering. Plunder allowed ambitious men to buy the things necessary and set up their own estates, and this became one of the stated reasons of why the council sponsored buccaneering. Buccaneers turned planters included George Brimacane, Lawrence Prince, and Modiford's closest ally, Henry Morgan. On the other hand, most of the money invested into the sugar trade did not come directly from regular buccaneers, but usually from the merchants who bought their plunder. Indeed, buccaneering did have negative consequences on agricultural development. For one, plundering seemed much more lucrative in the short term than spending years toiling on a farm, and buccaneer ships took away many of the settlers that were needed for normal jobs. The solution? The mass importation of enslaved Africans. Slavery was not really the preferred option, not necessarily out of ethical concerns, but because the governors realized how dangerous it was to have a significant population subdued and overworked against their will. They would have preferred to have a white majority, and made many attempts to sponsor European migration. Cromwell offered free land to adult men and children, and even deported indentured servants from Ireland and Scotland to settle the island. The big issue was tropical diseases, and most of the white settlers just dropped like flies. Jamaica earned a foul reputation as a hotbed of malady, and people refused to move there. Subsequent governors made desperate attempts to portray Jamaica as a fertile paradise, to little avail. And as aforesaid, when whites did move to Jamaica, it was in the hopes of getting a quick buck, and then getting the hell out. That is why buccaneering proved so lucrative for them, and it is also a reason why the white population declined after crackdowns on buccaneering. In 1661, there were 12,000 whites on the island. By 1671 and the peace between Spain and England, less than 8,000. It rose again to 12,000 by 1680, but by 1700 had dropped to 7,000. The lack of white settlers drove up the demand for African slaves, who then took up white jobs, which lowered the incentives for poor whites to move to Jamaica. This meant that the African population grew exponentially. In 1662, there were 400 slaves on Jamaica. 11 years later, almost 10,000, with the ratio of servant to slave being 1 to 54. Another 10 years, and it had doubled, with 23% of blacks in the British Empire living in Jamaica. Of course, a small number of them were not enslaved. Some had been freed by their masters and lived ordinary lives. Others had been free since Spanish times, allied themselves with the English during the Conquest, and owned slaves themselves. This was certainly true for many of the people of mixed descent. Modiford and his followers kick-started the sugar industry on Jamaica, but owing to the need, prominence, and profitability of buccaneering, and the time needed for the plantations to grow, it only constituted a minor part of the Jamaican economy. In 1671, there were only 57 plantations, exporting a mere 1,000 hogshead of sugar per year. This was the final year of his governorship, provoked by the Panama Incident. Henry Morgan and his freebooter army assaulted this prominent Spanish city, resulting in its destruction. Spain and England had signed a lasting truce a few months prior, with Spain finally recognizing Jamaica as English territory, and ending the looming threat of invasion which necessitated the policy of buccaneering. The Panama Incident caused a bit of a ruckus, with Modiford being deposed and arrested. He was replaced by Governor Lynch, who began the earnest investment into the sugar trade. 1671 truly seemed like the perfect year to ramp up the sugar production. Fear of Spanish invasion had prevented many from settling down, since the future of the island seemed uncertain. Buccaneering had been more profitable, but now, Port Royal had been so fortified as to defend the island, Spain had recognized Jamaica as English, and buccaneering outlawed. You had to find legal alternatives of making money instead. Pardons were offered to the buccaneers, granting each of them 35 acres of land. Few men saw any potential in it. A proper sugar plantation required between 150 to 500 acres, not to mention the aforementioned amount of machinery, materials, time, and patience, the latter of which the buccaneers lacked. Many decided to either continue stealing from the Spanish or even from English ships, and Lynch had to crack down violently, executing several of the perpetrators, depriving it of its major revenue source and defense. War broke out with the Dutch again, leaving the island defenseless, just as the economy tanked. Lynch's failures as a governor eventually saw him replaced by Governor Vaughan, and none other than Henry Morgan, the former admiral of the Buccaneers. After the Panama raid, Morgan had been granted a full pardon and knighthood by the king himself, along with the position of lieutenant governor of Jamaica. Vaughan entered the island in 1675 and began to address the two main economic issues: the sugar plantations and the logwood trade. Logwood is a type of legume that was used in the production of black dye. Though initially found on Jamaica, larger sources were soon discovered on the Yucatan Peninsula of modern-day Mexico. The problem was that the Spanish considered these woods to be theirs, so anyone who interloped to cut wood was a trespasser. The practice therefore proved appealing to buccaneers, especially after the peace forced them into less violent professions. Indeed, Jamaica's economy wasn't purely based on sugar. The population of cattle had somewhat recovered, allowing Jamaicans to produce leather and tallow. Smaller farms produced dyewoods, pimento, oranges, and a humble and funny-looking tuber that should not be frowned upon: ginger. Although produced by a couple of small landowners, ginger was often produced by large estates, since it was a surprisingly profitable product. Sold for medicinal and recreational purposes, the root was preserved in local sugar and shipped off in barrels. Another valuable product was indigo, a blue dye produced on both small and large plantations. Then there was cacao, often grown on walks along the roads of sugar plantations. Though it had always grown on Jamaica, Modiford was first to popularize it among the aristocracy. It never became a staple of the Jamaican economy, but still made up a decent export, and was likewise consumed locally in large amounts. Of course, no other produce could hope to beat sugar. as production skyrocketed with the Treaty of Madrid in 1671. 1,000 hogsheads were exported in that year. 11 years later, it had jumped to 10,000. By the 1690s, Jamaica produced as much sugar as Barbados, and it had become so prominent as to become the standard for local currency, with sugar often being used instead of specie. The biggest contributor to the growth of the sugar industry was, as aforementioned, the expansion of the slave trade. Despite England's efforts to break Spanish trade restrictions, they themselves operated under very similar laws. The Navigation Acts forbade colonies from trading with anyone but England, and the slave trade was monopolized by the Company of Royal Adventurers of England, later reorganized into the Royal African Company. Though Modiford himself was a factor in the company, he disliked both their monopoly and the Navigation Acts, since they hampered the growth of the sugar industry. The company had to sell slaves both to English and Spanish plantations, and just couldn't meet the high demands of the former. This demand had to be satisfied by illegal slave trade, and also the slaves taken from piratical raids. Slave raiding was endemic to Caribbean warfare, and Port Royal continued as a privateering hub for the remainder of the 1670s. It wasn't until the 1680s that piracy and smuggling was actively suppressed. This in part because Henry Morgan sought to butter up to the future king, who owned majority shares in the company. The company sought to strengthen their hold on the monopoly by constructing forts on the African coast, called factories, acting as depots for the human cargo. To fully understand Jamaica in the age of pirates, a description of the slave trade and plantation life is necessary. Most of the slaves came from West Africa, hundreds often packed into the tight confinements of pretty small ships. They were forced to subsist on poor food in unhygienic conditions, with mortality rates as high as 23.5%. Provided that the slave ship wasn't captured by pirates, or a pirate hunter if she was an interloper, she'd arrive and anchor in Port Royal, the commercial hub of the island. Interlopers would typically choose an isolated cove, of which the island had many. There were no slave markets. Instead, riders would be dispatched to spread the news of the ship's arrival, and the sale would be conducted on the very deck. While the news were being spread, company agents would inspect the slaves and divide them into categories, based on qualities like health, fitness, age, and attractiveness. Ethnic origins were also considered. The slaves were then exercised, washed, well-fed, and given tobacco to smoke, all to improve their spirits before the sale, make them more appealing. When everything was ready, they fired a cannon to signal the start of the auction. Farmers and planters were rowed aboard, and the auction was conducted in the same fashion as that of captured ships, that is, inch of candle. A bid was proposed, and a notch marked an inch down on a candle. The candle was then allowed to burn until a new bid was proposed. This system was naturally open to abuse, so the company often ordered set prices. In the late 1680s, Spain shifted from a tacit support of contraband slavery to open support. An agent of the Asiento was moved into Port Royal, attending these auctions in order to procure slaves for the Spanish colonies. Auctions were often loud occasions, with the buyers shouting and protesting, and the slaves panicking as they were separated from friends and loved ones. Virtually all industries on Jamaica deployed slave labor, ranging from cattle herding to agriculture, smallholders to grand estates. This is where most of the slaves would be marched off to. A description of them is necessary. Firstly, geography was key to a prosperous plantation. They were best constructed next to a river, for easier transportation and water wheels to power the mills. Inland waterways were the primary means of transport until the 70s and 80s, when road networks were finally built on the island. Next, the planter desired a high hill on which to construct his grand residence, a large, fortified structure, not unlike a medieval castle in its combination of luxury and defense. Here the planter could survey his estate, and perhaps the fine gardens encircling the house. Nearby was a dwelling house, home to a number of indentured servants and the plantation's caretaker, who oversaw the estate while the owner was absent. The indentured servants either worked in the household or as overseers of the slaves. It doubled as an armory, holding dozens of firearms, a handful of small artillery pieces, and the ammunition to shoot them. Not far from the houses, the cane fields grew, rising well above the head of a man. On the far side of them stood a watermill powered by the river, a boiling house with furnace and coppers, a still, and a village for the slaves. They lived in crude, rudimentary huts. Many also had livestock pens, all to supply mounts, beasts of burden, meat, and manure to fertilize the sugar fields. Finally, the plantations were often given some iconic name, sometimes derived from the planter's home, sorely missed. Henry Morgan named his plantation after his birthplace in Wales, Llanrymni. One of the most well-studied plantations had the name of Mesopotamia, seeking perhaps a connection to the fertility of civilization's cradle, but it does conjure an image of Bronze Age brutality befitting of the Bible, and so being ever relevant. Upon their arrival, the slaves were branded a second time, marking them as property of the planter. A branding iron of silver was heated and pressed into their shoulder, marking it with the owner's symbol. Thomas Sutton's symbol were his initials in the middle of a heart. Some were allowed to keep their birth name, others were renamed. These included humorous names, historical allusions, or those associated with animals or children. Some Jamaican slave names were Quashie, Dick, Hector, Hambo, Cromwell, Old Betty, Little Betty, Doll, and Daphne. New slaves could expect a 3-month period of seasoning, in which they were handed over to experienced slaves and taught the ropes. Many succumbed to diseases during this period, either inflicted by these squalid conditions or brought with them from Africa. Parasites like the hookworm were common. Another common cause was taking your own life. If they survived the seasoning, they were assigned a role. Healthy men typically performed back-breaking field labor, while women, children, and the elderly did lighter tasks. The former had an expected working life of less than 12 years. They were overseen by a so-called driver, so-called because, like a horse driver, they were always cracking the whip. Initially, they were indentured servants, but as the white population shrank, they became increasingly replaced by trusted blacks. One of them was named Hercules. He was also a doctor, known for mending both slaves and his white masters. Roughly 10% of the plantation's slaves were given skilled assignments, often as craftsmen or working in the mill and boiling house. Another 14% were designated to the household, and they too could expect cruelty and maltreatment. Sexual assault was very common, and the primary source of the island's significant mixed-race population. Especially notable are the escapades of Thomas Thistlewood, an 18th century overseer who, in his diary, confessed to having 3,285 sexual encounters with 138 different slave women. He eventually settled down with his favorite, a mixed-race woman named Fibba. The rest of the slaves were non-workers, including the sickly, old, new mothers, and babies. But by the age of 3, they could expect to join their mothers in the field and be put to work at 6. Plantation life was dictated by the 14 to 18-month sugar cycle. At the start of the wet season in June, the trenches were dug and the cane planted during 10-hour workdays. These were then continually weeded, manured, and kept free of pests. From January to May, the cane had matured and was ready for harvest. Every morning, the slaves were roused 2 hours before dawn by the call of a conch, and the slaves would cut the cane with machetes until noon, stopping for lunch. At 2 o'clock, work continued until dark. When the cane had been cut, it was carried to the mill house and ground up. It was dangerous work. If a finger was caught, the entire person would be drawn in and crushed. The cane juice was then taken to the boiling room and continually passed from cauldron to cauldron until a satisfying product had been made. To prevent the sugar from fermenting, the workers had to toil around the clock. Fires were lit, and the overseers had to make sure that no one fell asleep. If they did, they might risk life and limb. Should they get doused in boiling sugar, it was impossible to get off. The sugar was then left to cool before being packed in earthenware pots and drained of their molasses. After a month, the muscadavo was separated, dried in the sun, before being packed and shipped. From Port Royal it was taken to London, where it was refined into white sugar. The molasses was kept by the planters, mixed with skimmings and cane juices, stilled and fermented into rum. It is not unbefitting that the devil drink had the color of blood, considering its brutal origins, and its voracious overconsumption would lead to the deaths of many, not inappropriately being called kill devil. Whenever the slaves were not dictated to work, they were afforded some manner of free time, typically on Saturday afternoons and Sundays. They lived in small houses, often 4 by 6 meters, either gender divided or in families. Polygamy was permitted, and hard-working slaves could be rewarded with additional wives. They also farmed their own food and might tend to a few animals. Some were even allowed to carry weapons and hunt. Provisions and various craft items could also be bought and sold at the Sunday market, where they interacted with other slaves or the poor whites of the island. The rest of the Sunday was usually spent playing, singing, and dancing around a fire. They might even be permitted some rum. Even though it was a horrible life, the conditions of Caribbean slaves allowed them to construct family units and rudimentary societies, in contrast to the white settlers who were often migratory and never managed to form a majority. This is why Jamaica and the Caribbean at large has become a black country. The planters and politicians were not ignorant of slavery's consequences, specifically the looming threat of rebellion. The reason why the plantations were so heavily fortified was because the planters had to resist potential revolts, and they saw violence as their only way of keeping their chattel in check. In the words of Nicolas Lejeune, a French slave owner, "The unhappy condition of the Negro leads him to naturally detest us. It is only force and violence that restrains him." Flogging was the most common punishment, doled out for the smallest of reasons. One slave was punished for being saucy. After the whipping, it was common to pickle them, the wounds rubbed with pepper and salt, sometimes molten wax. The aforementioned thistlewood had a tendency to make other slaves defecate in the mouths of the flogged, before putting a gag in their mouth for 4 to 5 hours. For a minor infraction, you might be locked in the bilboes or forced to lie in the dirt with your legs hoisted up, sometimes for weeks. This could lead to permanent disability. Runaways were shackled heavily or given iron rings around their necks. Others were castrated, maimed, torn apart by dogs, burned to death. European visitors were disgusted by the extreme everyday brutality, but the white locals were so used to it as to be desensitized. Punishments, rough labor, diseases, and a horrible climate caused a massive slave mortality. In 1688, it was estimated that Jamaica had to import 10,000 slaves annually to maintain its population of 30,000, meaning that 1 in 3 were expected to die. To make a more well-known comparison, the slaves of the antebellum South were a costly investment and could not easily be replaced. Many of their mortal assignments were often given to paid laborers instead, often Irish immigrants, but this was not the case in the early modern Caribbean. The slave trade would not be banned until the early 19th century, so new slaves could just be imported to replace the casualties. Many could not live like this, and in spite of potential punishments, many slaves chose to resist. One of the minor but very common ways was theft and sabotage, both targeting whites and fellow slaves. Of course, so many of them decided to run. It was risky. Jamaica was dangerous, and many slaves did not stray far or for long. However, the ruggedness of Jamaican nature, the hills and mountains, also made it suitable for a long-term resistance. Those who had it in them could run off and join the Maroons. It has long been speculated whether the Maroons were entirely African, or consisted in part of the surviving Taino that resisted the Spanish. Genetic studies of the Uncompong town Maroons reveals partial indigenous ancestry, and though it is minor, it can be said with some certainty that the Maroons originally descended from the runaway Taino, or Yamai, later joined by a handful of white Spaniards that resisted English occupation. As time went on, they would become primarily black. Though some of the Maroons had betrayed the Spanish and joined the English, others continued to live free and resist them in the wilderness. They were continuously reinforced by runaway slaves, even white indentured servants at some points, and though the Maroon population never seems to have counted more than 1,000, was a serious threat to slave society, since the idea of a free community offered the potential to escape and resist. Many fled on their own, but there were those who joined up together in large groups. The earliest example came in 1673, when 200 Coromantee slaves rebelled and killed their masters. They came from a militaristic culture, many of them having battle experience. The militia sent after them were defeated, and they went on to form the Leeward Maroons. Inhabiting the secluded areas of the cockpit country, they formed permanent communities like Accompong Town, Trelawney Town, and Old Maroon Town. The next influential group were the Windward Maroons, forming communities at Crawford Town, Moore Town, and Nanny Town. The Maroon societies were highly complex, and there are many stories of their exploits and rebellions against the English. This will have to be tackled in a dedicated episode. If this is something you're interested in seeing, please tell me in the comments. And since you've been watching this far, you're probably enjoying this video, so if you're not like driving your car or anything, then please give the video a like, maybe share it with someone who is interested, because this will help in spreading it to more potential viewers. And if you have the money and really enjoy the content, the best way of supporting the channel is by donating on Patreon or becoming a channel member. That way you can also watch these videos without ads and get early access to them. Back to the story. Having become more established, the Maroons began launching raids on plantations in the 1680s. The conflict kept escalating over the decades, finally erupting into the First Maroon War of 1731. After 8 long and costly years of brutal guerrilla warfare, the Plantocracy signed a treaty with the Maroon leaders, Cudjoe and Nanny, giving them land and hunting rights, but obliging them to return runaway slaves and assist the planters in case of slave uprisings. In 1760, the Maroons made true to their promise, helping the slavers in putting down a revolt, and taking out its leader, Tacky. In spite of the peace between them, the planters were fearful of the Maroons' military proficiency, and in 1795 launched a new war to finally end them. After a year of besieging their strongholds, the Maroons were defeated and granted amnesty. 600 of them were deported to Nova Scotia. Jamaican politics between 1655 and 1692 should largely be seen as a struggle between 3 different interest groups: the plantation aristocracy, the merchants, and the buccaneers. All of them had various interests that sometimes coincided, sometimes collided, and they were continuously competing in order to influence the local government in their favor. The buccaneers were at their strongest between 1655 and 1671, when Jamaica was basically at war with the Spanish, allowing them to legally attack and plunder from them. The planters tolerated this, since the sugar industry was still in its infancy and they needed money to get it started. The merchants liked it, since they could buy and sell the plunder. After peace was signed with the Spanish in 1670, buccaneering was outlawed. The merchants sought peaceful trade with the Spanish, and the planters wanted stability without the threat of Spanish counterattack. However, since Jamaican defense was weak, the buccaneers were somewhat tolerated. This ended in 1680 after Henry Morgan had finished his fortification efforts, making Jamaica defensible without the aid of buccaneers. The 1680s marked the final crackdown of the full-time buccaneers. Now, the planters sought to rid themselves of the powerful merchant class. They served as middlemen to increase the cost of sugar exports. If the planters could get rid of the middleman and become their own exporters, they could make more money. Essentially, they wanted to become the merchants, and a lot of the planters were former merchants and buccaneers that had invested their earnings in plantation estates. Smuggling lay at the heart of Jamaican commerce. It was partly managed by a clique of Sephardic Jews living in Port Royal, their community hailing back to the Portuguese conversos settled there in the Spanish days. Since they spoke Spanish and had Jewish contacts in Spanish ports, they held the keys to contraband trade. As one might imagine, they were heavily disliked by the Jamaican Christians, largely because of economic rivalry. They held a lot of influence in the government, having a tradition of bribing newly instituted governors with a gold purse inside of a pie crust, a so-called Jew pie. Crucial to Jamaican smuggling was a domestically invented vessel, the Jamaica sloop. Built from the red cedar native to the country, we do not know for certain what it looked like. The sloops in the 17th century used a variety of rigs, though the Caribbean kind usually had one similar to its 18th century counterpart. They were, however, rakish and built for speed. They were so ubiquitous as to call Jamaican commerce the sloop trade, its sailors sloopmen. Port Royal was crucial to the sloop trade and the independent community of merchants and craftsmen. However, as the planters became more powerful in the 1680s, the town suffered a slow decline. Its demise was finally marked by its biblical destruction in 1692, when the Sodom of the New World suffered a horrible earthquake that pulled much of the city into the sea itself. Efforts to rebuild the settlement resulted in failure, and by the 1720s it had been reduced to a naval station. Port Royal was truly a Jamaican anomaly, as it represented an entirely different society. Whilst the rest of Jamaica was a plantation slave society, Port Royal housed a primarily white community of craftsmen, privateers and merchants, most of them migratory and uninterested in the long-term affairs of the wider country. They did not fear the Maroons because the point was isolated and defensible. But most of the economy was centered there, and all commerce, including slave imports and sugar exports, had to go through it, meaning that it was essential to the plantocracy that it was so isolated from. The destruction of Port Royal was therefore beneficial to the plantocracy. It also appears convenient that many, if not most, of the merchants and pirates there were taken out by the earthquake, while the rest of the island went by almost unscathed. There was, of course, the French invasion of the subsequent years. Exploiting the destruction of Jamaica's primary bastion, the French made intrusions into Jamaica's northern coast, attacking plantations and robbing away their slaves. However, Jamaica got its revenge when they teamed up with the Spanish to assault Saint-Domingue, France's own sugar empire, burning their estates and taking their slaves. Now it is their land, their blood. Indeed, neither the merchant nor buccaneer groups truly disappeared. Some of them remained, albeit reduced, but most of their roles had essentially been absorbed by the plantocracy. Merchants and buccaneers became planters, and planters became merchants and buccaneers. Besides running their estates, they contracted or went on merchant trips themselves, selling their sugar. Whenever a war broke out, they took up a letter of marque and went privateering. The late 17th century saw the emergence of this brutal and all-powerful plantocracy, symbolized by the emergence of Kingston, the new commercial hub to replace Port Royal, situated on the coast opposite to it. Port Royal was in all ways isolated from the mainland, Kingston a part of it. The wealth of the aristocracy allowed them to live in opulence, but shunned the wig so fashionable in Europe owing to the heat. It was only worn on Sundays, when they traveled to church in horse-drawn coaches. The ladies followed trends and taste as closely as those in Europe, and treated their guests to extravagant dinners in the Plantation manners, sufficiently ventilated and fashioned with mahogany floors. In fear of earthquakes, these structures were usually just one story high. The lives of the aristocracy were much unlike the white common folk and indentured servants. Poor white Jamaicans had a universally wicked reputation, as can be revealed by a dictionary of slang from 1685. It tells us that the entry "buccaneer" could refer both to the pirates we know and love, but also the rude rabble on Jamaica. The 18th century biography of John Plantation, a pirate, further clarifies the popular conception of these buccaneers. John Plantation was born in Chocolate Hole, on the island of Jamaica, of English parents who took care to bestow him the best education they themselves were possessed of, which was to curse, swear, and blaspheme, from the time of his first learning to speak. This is generally the chief education bestowed on the children of the common people in those parts. Swearing and blaspheming was so excessive among the common folk that the Jamaican Assembly passed a law forbidding it. Potty pie holes had to cough up a fine. It is unlikely that it did anything, and swearing was naturally encouraged by the common folk's excessive drinking. Rum punch, a cocktail of rum, water, sugar, and lime, was the preferred beverage, and since the rum was distilled in lead pipes, many Jamaicans suffered from a lethal malady called the dry gripes. In truth, it was lead poisoning. Rum was regarded as the poor man's drink, with the wealthier sort preferring Madeira wine. It is debatable if a better drink made them a better sort, and in the eyes of European visitors, Jamaican aristocrats were questionable and somewhat barbaric. Charles Leslie said how they prefer a pack of cards over the Bible, and considered discussions of the classics to be impolite. Their young daughters would dance, dress for admirers, and act the coquette, only to run off with household servants. Meanwhile, the noble sons would spend their early years with the slaves, picking up their manners and way of speak. Some were sent for education in England, for teachers were looked down upon in Jamaica itself. Other sons ended up spoiled and brattish, turning into fools and the butts of every conversation. Leslie's description of the Jamaican aristocracy is indicative of their martial character. This trait was necessary to quell the slave population, and no doubt originated from the island's conquest and buccaneering tradition. Although buccaneering had been suppressed, the planters would continue to engage in privateering, and Jamaica was used as a naval station since the late 1680s, when King William started deploying fleets there in action against France. He wanted to use a state navy for commerce warfare against his Monsieur enemy. William's conflict with France escalated to an entirely new level when the Sun King effectively claimed the Spanish monarchy, bringing the two kingdoms into a grand alliance. Jamaica was now facing the two other superpowers of the Caribbean basin, and the fleets departed once more to engage their great enemy. The merchants and planter aristocrats saw fit to renew the privateer trade. They outfitted a great number of ships and vessels, none of which gathered into a sizable force and assaulted the Darien Isthmus, the year 1702. Here they landed 530 men, augmented by 800 native allies that took them to the inland town of Santa Maria, notable for its gold mines. They occupied the town after a small engagement, forcing the remaining slaves to work the mines. After 21 days, they had dug up 80 pounds of gold dust and decided to depart. Jamaican privateers saw continued success throughout the war. It all came to an end in 1712, when Jamaica was struck by a devastating hurricane that destroyed 54 vessels and killed close to 400 men. The disaster was followed by news that the war had ended. Hundreds of Jamaican privateers were now without a job, having spent more than a decade roaming the seas for easy Spanish gold. It is difficult to give up on a lifestyle on a whim, and rather than going back to civilian employment, some of the privateers turned to piracy instead, continuing the war against France and Spain, but on their own terms. In 1713, they joined Benjamin Hornigold in setting up a base in the Bahamas. The depredations of pirates and smugglers provoked the deployment of the Spanish Coast Guard. Behaving little better than pirates themselves, they would harass regular merchants and innocents, taking the presence of Spanish coinage as evidence of crime. This was highly problematic, since Spanish money was the de facto currency of Jamaica. Jamaica's governor, Lord Archibald Hamilton, decided to summon the veteran privateers and equip them into a 10-ship flotilla. Their official purpose was to defend the island against the Spanish Coast Guard. But, in truth, they had a more insidious purpose. In 1714 passed the Queen of Britain, Anne Stuart, and instead of passing the throne to her brother, James, Parliament handed the crown to a distant relative, the German elector, George Ludwig. James was a Catholic, Ludwig was a Protestant. Hamilton and many of the privateers were part of a pro-Stuart movement called the Jacobites, and wanted to deploy their forces against the false government. However, the rebel fleet was soon distracted by the lure of gold. In 1715, a new hurricane wrecked the Spanish treasure fleet off Florida, and the privateers departed there on Hamilton's orders to, quote-unquote, suppress pirates. Instead, they joined the pirates in attacking the Spanish and taking their salvaged gold. Their holds now loaded with lucre, the fleet returned triumphantly to Jamaica. Many of the privateer captains were landholding aristocrats, and part of that militant plantocracy. Most prominent was the leader of the fleet, Henry Jennings, a landholder on Jamaica and Bermuda, and a generally unpleasant person. When he and the fleet returned to the Blue Island, the Jacobite plot had been foiled, Hamilton arrested, and the privateers declared pirates. They had to take refuge in the Bahamas, in Hornigold's pirate nest of New Providence, joining with the local pirates to become the Flying Gang. In 1718, they were offered royal pardons. Most of them took it and returned to their estates. Some continued sailing the seas and took up privateering again when conflict resumed in the final years of the decade, including Commodore Jennings. Jamaica continued to be used as a station for English fleets and privateering activity. Kingston expanded to become a worthy capital of the new Crown colony, with Jamaica's sugar production supplanting Barbados in the early 18th century. Unlike Port Royal, Kingston was constructed in an organized layout, making it safer and orderly. By 1774, it housed a population of some 14,000 people, becoming the third largest city in British America. Unlike Port Royal, Kingston housed a large slave population, some 60%, and it became a vital hub for slave import and export. The slave trade saw a resurgence after the American Revolution, with plantations across the Americas hungering for cheap labor. The whole industry was hampered in 1790 by the Haitian Revolution, when the slaves of Saint-Domingue rose up and defeated their French oppressors. Revolt did not spread to Jamaica. Instead, the road was slowly paved for the abolition of slavery itself. In 1807, the slave trade was abolished. Following a slave revolt between 1831 and 1832, the slaves were finally emancipated in 1834, though it was a long and grueling process. Since the War of 1812, Britain had been and would be at peace with its fellow Caribbean powers, and with the abolition of slavery, the final remnants of the buccaneering tradition had arguably been abandoned, forgotten, perhaps for the better. If you want to learn more about the pirate history of Jamaica, I can recommend to you this video covering Port Royal. And tell me in the comments what you found interesting, and if you have the available funds. The best support comes from monetary donations via channel membership and Patreon. Members also get early, ad-free access to all of my content. I release new videos every Thursday, so remember to subscribe and click the notification bell to get alerted about new releases. Enjoy!